Free college tuition has become a hot topic in the United States over the past several years, thanks in large part to people like Bernie Sanders.
We should have free tuition at public colleges and universities. That should be a right of all Americans.
But the question remains, is it actually a good idea, and how beneficial would it be? So in this video, I'm going to look at the pros and the cons of free college and explain why ultimately I don't think it's a good idea. But let's start with the pros, and I'll explain why they may not be as strong as you initially think they are. Now, the first pro you most often hear is that it'll make college affordable for everyone, and as a consequence, it'll help solve the student loan crisis. That is not entirely accurate, but let's go along that line of reasoning for a second. In 2019, the average student had $30,000 in debt by the time they graduated. Regardless where you stand on free college, I think we should all agree that this is not acceptable, that colleges have been consistently raising their tuition and students have just been paying it using student loans. And that's a vicious cycle that has caused tuition to increase or skyrocket over the past several years. So all of us should agree that a student graduating with $30,000 in debt, that's not a good thing. It makes matters even worse when you look at the fact that more than 600,000 students in the country have over $200,000 in debt. I can't even imagine graduating college and having $200,000 or more in student loan debt. That is astronomical. So how do we fix this? Well, free college would do something to fix it, but it wouldn't do as much as perhaps you think. This report from College Board found that in 2019, tuition accounted for only 40% of an in-state student's expenses. The other 60% included things like room and board, and books and supplies, transportation, and things like that. So I'm not going to pretend that 40% is an insignificant number by any means, because it's not. And when you go to private universities or out of state, it goes even higher than 40%. But 40% of your total expenses is still only just 40%. If you put that into real numbers, that means that $30,000 in student loan debt would decrease by 40% to roughly $18,000, which is a decrease for sure, but it's still $18,000. So just making college tuition free wouldn't really be enough to make it affordable for everyone, and it would not solve the student loan crisis, which is why people like Bernie Sanders want to take this one step further, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Before we look at the next pro, if you've appreciated the information so far and you've learned something from it, be sure to subscribe, because I put out videos like this on a semi-frequent basis, and I think you might enjoy them. But for now, let's jump to the second pro. And this one is related to the first one, but essentially saying that you'd have more people going to college. You would see a higher enrollment rate at these universities and at these colleges, which is 100% true. This report found that for every $1,000 drop in schooling costs, college attendance increases by 3 to 4 percentage points. But we don't even have to talk about this theoretically. Let's just look at Germany, where over the past decade, they made the change to go completely college tuition free. And what they saw was a 22% increase in college enrollment. So without a shadow of a doubt, you can say that more people would go to college if you make college tuition free. That just kind of makes sense. However, I want to push back on the premise that more people going to college is necessarily a good thing, because that in and of itself has some issues. There's a notion in the United States that we're for some reason uneducated, that when you look at European countries, the United States is often viewed as less intelligent or less educated. And I know many people like to joke about how uneducated or stupid we are in the United States, especially Florida man, and for Florida man it is accurate. But the fact of the matter is, we are one of the most educated countries in the world. If you look at our citizens between 25 and 64 years old, 32% of them have a bachelor's degree. We are in second place just behind Norway at 35%. And so we don't have a problem with undereducation. As a matter of fact, we have the opposite problem. There is an issue with overeducation in America. Essentially what that means is that there are more college graduates than there are jobs for them to fill. And we can sum that up in a few quick statistics. If we look at this article from the Washington Post, for example, it shows that only 62% of college graduates are actually working in a job that requires a college degree. That means that 38% are doing a job that they didn't need to go to college for in the first place. We also see that only 27% are working in a job that is related to their major at all. So the other 73% went to college, got a degree, and aren't even using that degree in their day-to-day jobs. That doesn't really make sense to me. And overeducation can lead to this problem of degree inflation, at least according to Harvard Business School, where they say that degree inflation is where you require a college degree for jobs that were traditionally held by middle skill workers. The end result goes something like this. 3 to 5 employers will reject qualified middle skill candidates with relevant experience in favor of a recent college graduate. Again, even though that job does not require a college degree. And in spite of the fact that those same employers generally perceive degreed and non-degreed workers in the same occupation as nearly or equally productive on many performance metrics. So essentially what's happening here is because so many people are already going to college, employers are looking at those who have degrees and saying incorrectly that they must be more skilled or more productive or more efficient at these jobs. And so even though the job doesn't require a college degree, they are giving it to someone who has one because they think erroneously that they're going to be a better worker, even though those same employers say that that really isn't the case. And this is the problem with overeducation. When you have so many people getting degrees and they can't find jobs where they need to use that degree, they're going into other areas and taking away the jobs of those who don't have degrees. That is called degree inflation. And if the ultimate goal is to make America more educated or more intelligent, we shouldn't look at higher education. Why don't we start with K through 12? Because by the time they get to college, in many instances, they're already behind. If we look at this 2015 report, we find that 25% of students are proficient in math and 37% in reading. But it gets even worse, because if you look at those who are below basic achievement, 38% of them are below basic achievement in math and 28% in reading. So just to compare that, you have more students who are below basic achievement in math than who are proficient in math. And these are the students who are graduating and then, in many instances, going to college, which shows that they're not ready for it. As a matter of fact, this 2017 report found that at least 209 colleges across the United States placed more than half of their incoming students in at least one remedial course. Once again showing that these students who are going to college were not prepared for college through their K through 12 education. So in my opinion, rather than spend the billions of dollars that it would cost to have free college tuition, it would be a better idea to just fix our K through 12 education, because that does apply to pretty much everybody. So I think that K through 12 needs revamping before we can even talk about higher education. But let's keep going with my pros because I'm not done yet. Another pro you often hear, and this one I will actually agree with, is that if you make college tuition free, you're going to have a higher graduation rate. And this does seem to be the case. Because if you look at the reason for college dropout rates, you find that 30% of them said they weren't getting their money's worth, and it would be hard to not get your money's worth if you're not paying for college. And then 54% said they dropped out of college because they were unable to balance work and school. So arguably, both of those percentages would decrease fairly dramatically if college tuition were not paid for by the students themselves. So this is something we can actually see in the Tennessee Promise program. This was a program that Tennessee implemented to make community colleges tuition free. And there are some requirements, but they're not really that difficult to achieve. What they found is that when they first implemented the program, they had about a 14% graduation rate from community colleges. But now, several years later, that graduation rate has skyrocketed to 25%. And maybe skyrocket is a bit of an exaggeration there, but it increased from 14% to 25%. That's an 11% increase, which is pretty dramatic in my opinion. Now, it's still only 25%, and if you're looking at college graduation rates at a community college, I would like that to be a lot higher than 25%, but this does show that in Tennessee, making community college free increased the graduation rate. So that is certainly a pro that I can't dispute because the data supports it. There are more pros than this, I understand. I've only covered 3 or 4 of them. If there are more you can think of that I haven't talked about that you think are very relevant, go ahead and let me know in the comment section down below. But now we're going to pivot and start talking about the cons, which I think outweigh the pros fairly dramatically. The first con is obviously this is going to be real expensive. If we look at Bernie Sanders' plan that he put out back when he was running in the presidential election, he said that his plan would cost at least $48 billion per year. And this article from the New York Times, while simultaneously saying it's less expensive than you think, actually increases that to $79 billion, or at least $79 billion a year. And I understand it can be difficult to exactly pinpoint how much a proposal will cost, but it frustrates me when someone says it'll cost at least this much. Can you imagine if you went to a store and you saw a price tag that's going to be at least $5? It could be as much as $10, $15, $20. It could be anything, and it's at least $5. So this at least terminology is pretty stupid, but let's put that to the side. It could cost around $79 billion. Let's say that. That is a lot of money. But someone like Bernie Sanders doesn't even want to stop there, because he wants to cancel the entire $1.6 trillion student loan debt that we have right now, which is even more money. But at least for this one, we know how much it's going to cost because it says so right there. But that's a lot of dough, and we don't have that much money in the United States. We're already 20-something trillion dollars in debt. I think it was 28 or 29 trillion dollars. So, let's just keep spending even more money. Nothing bad could ever happen by going into debt. Even though we're trying to get the students out of debt because it's a bad thing, and we go in debt in the process, but don't think about that stuff. If you thought that was bad, Bernie Sanders isn't even done yet, because he recognizes, at least to an extent, that tuition is only a fraction of the cost. And we talked about that earlier. Tuition is about 40% of the total cost of a college student's expenses. So what he wants to do is something I think is fairly dramatic. First, he wants to increase the number of Pell Grants to low-income students specifically to cover the non-tuition costs of school, such as housing, books, supplies, transportation, and all of those things we talked about earlier, which I guess sounds reasonable, but here is where he goes completely off the deep end. He then wants to require being the key word here, participating states and tribes to cover the full cost of obtaining a degree for low-income students by covering any gap that may still exist. So Bernie Sanders' plan is essentially as follows. Step 1, let's make college completely tuition-free. Step 2, let's cancel all of the current student loan debt. Step 3, let's provide more Pell Grants to low-income students so that they can use that for anything that they need, like housing or food. And Step 4, because that still might not be enough, let's require the states to cover any additional cost that a student could possibly incur at a university. Now, if that doesn't seem like a recipe for disaster, then that's maybe because you haven't thought about it. He says that we're going to include housing and books, supplies, transportation, everything. As a student, you could essentially incur almost any cost and just claim it's a cost associated with college, and Bernie Sanders would want the state to have to pay for it. Instead of living in a reasonable apartment, just get something really expensive because the state's gonna pay for it. Instead of surviving with an older laptop, just buy a new one. It could be a couple $1,000s, the state's gonna pay for it. This just doesn't make any sense to me, especially when you consider the fact that only 41% of college students actually graduate within 4 years. The other ones drop out, but others keep going for 6 years, maybe even more. So it's not like you're only covering a 4-year span for some students. It can go much higher than that, and that's going to make everything much more expensive. I do want to point out, this is kind of not super relevant, but I thought it was kind of funny and interesting, that when I was doing this research, I found that about 20% more men drop out compared to women. And I thought this was interesting because if the roles were reversed, if you had more women dropping out than men, then it would be because of sexism and the patriarchy. However, even though more men are dropping out, you can't say it's sexist or it's because of the matriarchy, because that would sound stupid. So it just goes to show that disparities don't necessarily equate to some sort of oppression or sexism. That's not how it works, even though many on the left like to pretend that is how it works. It's just not. More men dropping out does not happen because women are oppressing them. That's stupid. But let's get back to the real matter at hand. There are some people, like Joe Biden, who recognize that this would be really expensive. So he's going to try and cut costs and look at just having free community college, which would certainly be a lot less expensive than all colleges, but it would still cost a good amount of money. And it would have other negative effects as well. This paper from the University of Chicago and Princeton found that if you make community college free, you're going to have students who are called diverted students. And they're going to be about a third of total students going to community colleges. They are those who normally would have gone to a 4-year college directly, but if community college itself is free, they're going to be diverted from a 4-year degree program to a community college first. Which maybe sounds fine, because you can start at a 2-year college and then go up to a 4-year college. The problem is that many of them don't do that. They found that diverted students complete roughly half a year less of total education and are 18% less likely to complete a bachelor's degree than if they had gone to a 4-year college directly. So even just looking at community colleges, there are going to be some issues here. Now, another con is that you're going to get more government involvement in higher education more generally. And I think this makes sense why, but let me run through my process here. So let's say that the government is paying for everybody's tuition, and they're just covering the cost of tuition. Now, colleges have been consistently increasing tuition because they're financially incompetent, essentially. They're looking out for their own interests, they want to maximize profits, and the best way they can do that is by increasing tuition. Because they're trying to attract more students by building buildings they don't need, having more technology, things that are pretty much irrelevant, but the students are going to come and pay anyway, so they can just keep doing it. I previously made a video about why tuition is so expensive, and if you're interested, you should go check it out. It'll be linked up here. But the fact of the matter is, one of the reasons that tuition continually increases is because students are paying for it with student loans, but also with Pell Grants. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that for every dollar given out in student loans, tuition increased by 65 cents. But also, for every dollar given out in Pell Grants, tuition increased by 55 cents. So what this means is that even if the federal government were paying for everyone's tuition, essentially providing more and more Pell Grants, tuition would still be increasing at a fairly high rate. Now, the federal government naturally would limit what tuition can be. They'd say, if we're paying for it, we're not going to let you go higher than X amount, for example, which is reasonable. But what is also reasonable is if the federal government is paying for it, they're going to be more involved in what is being taught at that university. And this isn't really just speculation. Once again, we can look at Germany and see that this has already happened. This is an article written by someone who was a professor in Germany for over a decade. And they noted that when the state foots the entire bill, politicians have much more incentive to demand oversight of these universities. That eliminating tuition means that universities become more like primary schools or public utilities, and they'll become more vulnerable to funding decisions by agencies, leading to more control and bureaucracy. And it stands to reason the same thing would happen here in the United States. Anytime the government is paying for something, they want to see where their money is going and make sure it's being used effectively. Now, they're really bad at it, but they try to do it anyway. So if they're paying for universities, they're going to want to know what those universities are teaching and where the money is going. And maybe you think that sounds like a good thing because you like more government oversight. But let me push back just a little. Let's look at K-12 education. We've already done that a little bit, but I don't think anyone can seriously say that the government is doing a good job educating our young students. Because they're not. I'm sorry, they're just really doing a horrible job. So what you want to do is take the same government that is failing K-12 education and then pile on top of that higher education as well? You want them to fail upwards, I suppose? It doesn't really make that much sense. And even if you don't think that is a problem, consider the fact that universities, like I've already talked about, are financially incompetent, and the federal government is also financially incompetent. So what you want to do, if you support free college, is take these two organizations that don't know how to deal with money and throw them together and expect to have a positive result somehow? I don't quite follow that. So in my mind, at least looking at it financially, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. Either the government comes in and demands more oversight because they're paying for colleges and universities, and then they treat that just like they're doing K-12, which sucks, or we allow colleges to keep going as they have been, but now the government is footing the bill as opposed to the students. Neither of those seems like a good idea or solution to me, so not a big fan. And the last con I want to talk about just really briefly is that if we make college tuition completely free, this would just make higher education even more an extension of high school than it already is. And that's something that I'm not a fan of. There are plenty of ways to succeed in life without going to college, especially without having the taxpayers pay for it. And I don't like the fact that right now, when you graduate high school, even though you're woefully unprepared for college, as we've already seen, the push is that you go to college because that's just what you do. And sure, a lot of people should go to college. We need to have an educated population, but not everyone has to go. And there'd be much less incentive to not go to college if it were completely free. And maybe you think that's a good thing, and I think to some extent it is. But on the other hand, that's going to hurt a lot of middle-skilled workers who didn't go to college and perhaps don't want to go to college because their jobs are going to be lost to someone who did go to college, even though it shouldn't be a requirement. And I have one personal example which is kind of related to that. One of the things that frustrates me beyond any other is that there are so many jobs that require a college degree, even though they don't care what your major was in. And this, to me, makes no sense. Now, I understand the employers recognize you went to college, and to them, this means you must have a certain set of skills. But the fact of the matter is, that's not the case. Plenty of people didn't go to college and have those same skill sets. Now, the example I wanted to give was actually my wife, that she worked at a drug prevention program for a number of years, which was essentially just the DARE program, where she would go to middle schools and teach them about drugs. And it was kind of funny because whenever they'd see her outside middle school, they'd call her the drug lady, which she wasn't a fan of for obvious reasons. But the fact of the matter is, they required a college degree for her job, even though they didn't care what the degree was in. My wife had a degree in family life, which is kind of like the humanities, and she had a coworker who had a degree in history, and they both had to have degrees in order to do that job. But that didn't make any sense. If your job requires a degree, but it's not specific to any degree at all, I don't think you should require that degree in the first place. It just seems really stupid to me, and it's a really good way to make it so that middle skill workers or those who don't have degrees aren't able to get jobs that perhaps they're qualified for just because they don't have some piece of paper. That's a bad idea in my opinion, and I think this would just exacerbate that problem. If we make it so that everyone needs to go to college and we push everyone to go to college, those who choose not to are going to be in a much, much worse place. So you're essentially pushing everyone to go and saying if you don't go, for whatever reason, you're just going to be left behind and who cares? And again, we already looked at the fact that a lot of people, perhaps most people, going to college aren't even prepared for it. That K-12 education doesn't do a good job preparing you for college. So why should we push college to be free and everyone to go when instead we could focus on K-12 education and actually make it useful, or at least more useful? I'm not going to pretend it's complete garbage, just mostly garbage. And this was a really long video. Hopefully you managed to get through it and it wasn't too boring. But at this point, I want you to let me know if there are any pros or cons that I really missed out on. If there's something you can think of, tell me in the comment section below. Or if there's a reason you're really strongly for or against free college, well, let me know that too. If you haven't yet, be sure you subscribe because you've watched the entire video, so I must have kept your attention for some reason. But as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.